the African continent. In today's edition of Unpopular Opinion, we are discussing the forgotten Holocaust in the Congo. Between 1885 to 1908, Belgium murdered half of the population in the Congo. 10 million corpses, mountains of severed hands, all because of rubble. This has been erased completely from history textbooks. Joining me to discuss King Leopard genocide in the Congo is Professor Adam Hochschild. He is a Jewish descendant of Holocaust survivor. He is the author of the book King Leopard Ghost, the man who exposed the butcher of the Congo. Thank you so much, Prof, for joining us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion. Your research uncovered King Leopard hand collection policy, where soldiers brought harvested hand to account for the amount of bullet used, as well as Congolese children's hands were being harvested because quota weren't met. Could you walk us through hand collection policy of King Leopard? Why do you think the Belgian government has refused to acknowledge and accept that their government committed genocide and war crime in the Congo?
Well, the business of cutting off people's hands is just one small part of this gigantic tragedy. It evolved, the hand business evolved and became particularly notorious because there were outside witnesses to this, American missionaries, for example. King Leopold, who owned this territory as his private, personally owned colony from 1885 to 1908, as you said, administered a ruthless regime there, which put people to work gathering ivory and wild rubber. This was forced labor or slave labor. It was enforced by the king's private army, Black African conscripts under white officers, and they would go into village after village and force the men to go into the forest to gather wild rubber. They would do this by holding the women of the village hostage in chains in order to force the men to do this. There were rebellions against this regime. Many of them, tens of thousands of Congolese died fighting it. So these soldiers were often fighting against rebels. The rule was for many of them that you had to bring back the severed hand of a victim to your white commanding officer to prove that you had used your bullet to actually kill somebody who was rebelling, rather than saving the bullet for possible use in a mutiny, which was something that happened with great frequency. So that's where the practice of the cutting off hands came from. But the big picture is that King Leopold's conquest of the Congo, like the conquest of almost all of Africa south of the Sahara during the era beginning around 1870 or so, was founded upon forced labor. All of the African economies in the colonial areas, which meant almost all of Africa, operated this way, and that accounts in the Congo for the enormous death toll.
To our listeners, if you want to see us in quality studio, if you want to see us with quality microphones, if you want to see us doing live interviews with our guests, we encourage you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel, as well as recommend this podcast to your friends and family members to be subscribers. I also talked about, I want us to talk about, why do you think the Belgium government up to date has refused to recognize this as a genocide or as a crime that was being committed by their government at the time?
Yeah. No government is very good at acknowledging disgraceful or murderous periods of a country's past, unless people force it to do that. In the United States, for example, the story of the brutalities of American slavery, which affected millions upon millions of people over hundreds of years, were something that was largely left out of school textbooks, or at least not talked about in vivid detail in school textbooks, until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. When I studied slavery in my high school American history class in the 1950s, I never read a single slave narrative. I never read a description of what life was like on a slave plantation. But when my children went to high school 20 and 30 years later, they did learn these things. And that's because the civil rights movement in the United States, which made some considerable advances, forced Americans to deal um, with the unpleasant parts of our history, which include slavery and the conquest of the Native Americans who were here long before white people arrived from Europe. And I think it's the same thing in all countries. Nobody likes to acknowledge the painful things. Britain, for example, does a much better job of talking about the brutalities of British colonialism, the immense brutalities of British slavery in the British West Indies, than Belgium does in talking about its colonial period in Africa. Why? Because there are more than 2 million people of African descent in Britain, and probably under 100,000 people of Congolese descent in Belgium. So, as I say, I think a country deals with the painful parts of its history only when there's somebody lobbying for it to do so. Otherwise, nations like to celebrate themselves.
You wrote in your you wrote that there are many people that died in the Congo than in the Holocaust in Europe. Uh, and up to date, we see that uh, those that committed the crimes in Europe were being tried during the Nuremberg trial. But up to date in Belgium, you see artifacts stolen, and some of those things that were being stolen from the Congo or crimes that are being committed in Congo are still being represented in museums today. Do you think this is a fair judge? I mean, do you think that those museums and those holding those properties should be prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity?
I, I would not be in favor of prosecuting the museums for crimes against humanity because, after all, these are people 3 or 4 generations later than the crimes were committed. And if we're all guilty for things that were done 3 or 4 generations ago, most people on Earth then would have things to atone for. The question about returning artifacts is a big one and a powerful one, and there's an issue everywhere. And there are many African countries who are demanding getting these artifacts back. In practice, it has not worked out so well. Um, the big Africa Museum in Belgium, which holds most of the publicly exhibited artifacts there, did return a number of items to the National Museum in the Congo some 20 or 30 years ago. And many of these items subsequently wound up for sale in antiques markets in Brussels. Um, so they've been discouraged from doing anything like that again. There are parts of Africa and many parts of the world south where governments are better functioning and where that would not happen. And I certainly believe, as a general principle, that artifacts that were taken from somewhere else should be returned to where they were taken from, provided there are people or institutions who are going to take safe care of them there.
All right. I want us to look at your book. The book you wrote, it inspired so many conversations around the world, especially in Belgium, in Europe, and other parts of the world. Uh, what inspired that book? What was the motivation behind that book?
Well, I've always been interested in issues of human rights. Um, at the time I was growing up, there was the civil rights movement in the American South. My then girlfriend, now wife, and I were briefly civil rights workers in the state of Mississippi. I also took part in the movement against the Vietnam War in the United States, so I had some sense of the enormous damage that industrialized countries can do to other countries in the world south. And I knew something about the history of colonialism because I'd spent time in Africa as a journalist and actually had written a book about South Africa. Um, but I came across a passing reference and a book about something else entirely to a figure of 8 to 10 million people died in King Leopold's Congo. I knew that King Leopold at one point owned the Congo as his personal, privately owned territory. And I was startled by that because uh, I knew colonialism was a bloody business, but that many people killed in that one territory, that seemed incredible to me. So I started doing research, and indeed I found when I looked at general histories of Africa that almost everybody uses a figure like that. Sometimes the estimate is 8 million people, sometimes it's 10 million. A very well-known book, The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, uses an estimate of 11 million people, but she mentions it only in a footnote. So I wondered, what's the story there? Why don't we know more about this? And then when I began exploring the story, I found something else that astounded me, which was that during much of the time that this killing was going on, and we should be clear, by the way, that it's not just killing. When we talk about the population of the Congo being cut in half, that's not necessarily half the population being killed, but it's a loss of population that happens because when you have slave labor conditions and people, tens of thousands of people fleeing into the rainforest to avoid being captured as slave laborers, people stop having children. When you have people half starved, they often die of diseases that healthy people would have survived. So it's more correct to talk about a loss of population of some 10 million people rather than 10 million deaths. Anyway, what I discovered was that during part of the period when this was going on, or namely about the first decade of the 20th century, 1901 to 1912 or so, this was the most known human rights scandal in the world. There were literally thousands of newspaper articles about this, pictures of people with their hands cut off, pictures of these women hostages in chains. It was a huge story. Why did it get forgotten? I think it got forgotten largely because in 1914, the First World War began. Belgium was invaded by Germany and indeed treated very badly, very harshly. And all of British and American and French war propaganda was based on coming to the aid of poor little neutral, violated, invaded Belgium. And so it didn't suit anybody to remember the terrible things that Belgians were accused of doing in the Congo just a few years previously. So then this scandal got forgotten. The First World War, of course, had immense devastation of its own, incidentally, in Africa as well as in Europe. And in the 1920s, the world was sort of recovering on that and focusing on that and figuring out who to blame for that. And so the tragedy in the Congo got forgotten, as did the enormous bloodshed that was involved in the colonial conquest of other parts of Africa as well.
Oh, okay. You know, but I'd like to understand from your perspective as a scholar on this field, uh, why do you think that government or institutions around the world, like the Congolese, since 1885 up to date, there has been continuation of war violence in the country, and there is no means of bringing an end to that conflict. There is succession of government from colonialism to independence, and from independence, succession of governments, new government comes into power, but at the same time, the cycle of violence continues to happen. Why do you think is the cause of that, and what the international community needs to do?
Well, Congolese friends have sometimes said to me, we wouldn't have so much trouble if we weren't so rich. And I think by that they mean that here is a country which is enormously rich in natural resources. Uh, Gold, diamonds, coltan, which is in everybody's cell phone, wild rubber, tin, manganese, uranium, timber, anything else you can name. This area, today the Democratic Republic of Congo, uh, has more wealth per square kilometer than almost any other territory on Earth. Uh, I think when you combine that with a country that has, in effect, no functioning national government, then that means that major corporations, local warlords, the armies of surrounding African countries, it becomes very easy for them to come in and help themselves to this wealth. I've been there a couple of times in recent years, and if you stand on the border, you can almost see the wealth flowing out of the country. Truckloads of logs heading across the border for Uganda, airplanes overhead, flying tin ore out of the country. And then what you can't see is many people are crossing the border on, motorcycles or bicycles are often smuggling gold dust, and sewn into the seams of their clothing. It's estimated only about 2% of the gold leaving the country is actually taxed. So when you have this enormous wealth in a place that has a very badly functioning or non-functioning government, it's an invitation for people to come in and rob, and that's what they've been doing. Parts of Africa where the government functions much better, um, this is not the case. I mean, look at Botswana, which is two countries away, has been quite prosperous, very little corruption, has managed to retain a large part of the diamond wealth that it produces. If the foreign company wants to come in and mine diamonds in Botswana, they have to give the Botswana government 50% of the ownership, and that money gets recycled into local universities and schools and so forth, and they're doing quite well. It was harder to have that happen in the Congo because independence came there very suddenly in 1960 after demonstrations demanding it. And the Belgians had made almost no preparation for that. Up until the last few years, there was no university there. At the time of independence, there were less than 3 dozen university graduates in the entire country. And this is a country as big as the United States east of the Mississippi River. Um, and as I say, that absence of functioning government and the presence of great wealth made it easy for people to come in and steal.
This video is proudly sponsored by Magnite clothing brand. If you are living in Europe or in any parts of the world and you need an African clothing, you can simply check them up on their Instagram page. The link is in the description of this video. I want to ask you about, if you check through the pages of history, Hitler is being discussed in detail about the crimes he committed. And why is it difficult for people to be able to find out information about King Leopard concerning his crimes he committed on the other hand? Why do you think he's not being portrayed as evil, but instead another person is also being portrayed as evil, while both of them committed similar crimes?
Well, unfortunately, there's no shortage of very evil rulers in history who have uh, ordered directly the killing of many people under their control, or who have, in the case of Leopold, instituted policies that resulted in the deaths of enormous numbers of people. I think one reason why Leopold is not sort of put in the same place of scorn as Hitler is that um, Leopold was extremely good at public relations. For most of his reign, up until the very end, he managed to convince most people in Europe and the United States that he was really doing philanthropic work in the Congo and bringing civilization and commerce and Christianity to people who hadn't known these things before. He was an absolute master of public relations. The last few years of his reign, he could no longer maintain this, but for a long time, he did maintain this. And I think for Europeans and Americans, um, somehow in their way of thinking, I hate to say this, but it is the way many people think. They are much more conscious of atrocities when the victims of these atrocities are white people like themselves. Hence, we pay a lot of attention to the Holocaust, to the destruction of the world wars, um, and we don't pay as much attention to the ravages of colonialism in Africa or of slavery throughout the Americas. I think that's beginning to change, but that is the way it's often been until now.
To our listeners, if you are enjoying this conversation, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel if you want to see us in better studio, if you want to see us with quality microphones, if you want to see us doing live interview with our guests. I want you to please subscribe to this YouTube channel. You can also share and encourage your friends and family members to be subscriber of this channel. You talked about PRO. In 1905, we saw New York Times referring to the people of Congo as savages that needed civilization. Those were the words that were being used. And some of the weapons that were being used at the time were American-made weapons that were being given to King Leopard while he was carrying out his genocide against the people of the Congo. So do you think the Congolese government, if there's a stable government in Congo, should sue Belgium for the colonial crimes that their government committed in the past?
Yeah, I generally favor some kind of reparations to be made for the ravages of colonialism and slavery. It's often hard to figure out exactly how to do this. It's particularly hard when you don't have well-functioning governments in the territories that were victims. But as a general principle, I think one should do this sort of thing. Yeah.
This is a very short interview, and I think we are almost on end of this interview. Prof, if you being a human rights advocate, what are some of the challenges that you go through, and also advocating for some of those things that are happening to Africans? What are some of the challenges you experience? Are there some setback that you've experienced over the years working with civil rights advocate movements up to date?
Actually, I can't claim that I myself have suffered any hardships because of the writing that I do. Um, it's the people living in these places, living in Congo today, who are, you know, earning the equivalent of, $2 American a day for a long day of labor in a mine or something, who've inherited this tremendously oppressive system there. They're the ones who are suffering, and they're the ones whom we should be paying attention to. I have a comfortable home and a good job in a university, and happily am living in a country where, at least for the moment, I can still keep writing. I'm not sure what will happen if Trump continues in power for as long as he would like, but I cannot claim that I've suffered any setback. I encountered some angry Belgians who got angry about things in this book. Um, and there've been some attacks on me in Belgium, particularly by people who themselves or whose ancestors worked in the Congo during the Belgian colonial days. But, to be criticized in print is not a hardship.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prof, for joining us on this edition of Unpopular Opinion. It has been an absolute honor to have you. Is there any final word that you'd like to tell our audience out there? If maybe there are questions that you expected me to have asked and I didn't ask, can you share light on that?
I can't think of any, except I just hope everybody listening everywhere will wish us well in the United States in bringing Trump's regime to an end. I'm not sure how we're going to do that or how quickly we can do that, but I I see that as something which will, is spreading a great deal of suffering, not just in the United States, but throughout the world at this point. So just know that we're working on it here and we can appreciate your help.
This brings us to the end of today's edition of Unpopular Opinion. Thank you so much, Prof, for being our guest. It has been an absolute honor to have you. And to our listeners, if this conversation moved you, we encourage you to please be a subscriber of our YouTube channel, as well as recommend this podcast to your friends and family members. Keep this conversation alive, keep engaged, keep informed, and remain unapologetic Africans. Until we meet again, peace.